There we go. So the topics that I thought might be useful to discuss, and afterwards, I'm looking forward to any questions and comments you guys have. First, I would just give you a very brief overview of SARS-2 and COVID-19, or SARS-CoV-2. It's not even done right. I thought I would chat briefly, why is it so transmissible? Because that question has come up before. What's the role of vaccines in dealing with the pandemic? What about the current vaccines and their safety? And what about these pesky variants? So let's go into that. Well, first I wanted to distinguish between what is COVID-19 and what is SARS-CoV-2. So COVID-19 is the disease itself. It's not a virus, it's the disease. It's coronavirus disease 2019. There are other coronavirus diseases that cause common cold. There was the original SARS, which is a different virus and a different disease, but this one is COVID 2019. It is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. And SARS-CoV-2 stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. That's the SARS coronavirus 2. And just the point of that name, the reason why it's worth just noticing is the word respiratory, because even though we found that this virus can do all sorts of things, really its primary activity or original activity, starting activity, is in the lungs. It's a respiratory virus. And then it can go other places and cause lots of problems that we'll talk about in a bit. So that's COVID is the disease, and SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. So why is it called coronavirus? Well, here's some pictures, electron microscope pictures of coronaviruses. And you can see that they have these little protrusions on the outside. They're circular, and they have these little things that stick out, and it's like a crown. And so you can see coronas, the UK crown, the solar corona, you can see the Mexican crown. This is why it's called coronavirus, because it looks like a crown. And there's, again, other coronaviruses besides this particular SARS-CoV-2. So this drawing, this picture, which I think is pretty nice, this 3D picture of the virus, is valuable because it shows you viruses are actually very simple little beasts. They're not really alive, and they're not really dead. And you can have a big philosophical debate over that, but they're not alive because they can't reproduce by themselves. They have to invade other living cells, whether they're human cells or animal cells or bacterial cells. They have to invade them and basically commandeer the machinery that allows them to replicate. They just can't do it. So they're not really live, but they're not dead because they can replicate if you give them the chance. Viruses in general are much smaller than bacteria. Bacteria are alive. And there's lots of viruses that you may know, I'm sure you know, you've been encountered. There's viruses that cause the common cold, a different number of them do. Polio is caused by a virus, smallpox, the scourge of mankind, chickenpox, measles, influenza, shingles caused by a virus, actually the same virus that causes chickenpox, but just shows up years later. Obviously, HIV, AIDS, that's a virus, and there's many, many viruses. And already we all get various vaccines to prevent viral diseases, but we also get them to prevent bacterial diseases. And I know a number of people, I've heard this a lot, think, aren't vaccines just for viruses? And the answer is no. They can be, and they are, against bacteria. They're against even, you can have them against fungus, you can have them against cancer cells. So a vaccine doesn't necessarily care, and we'll talk maybe a bit later about what vaccines really are. But you have viral vaccines and you have bacterial vaccines. So example, just so you know, if you don't, it doesn't come to mind, DTP that children get, DTP shots, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. That's a vaccine. Each of those are bacteria, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. So if you look at the left side, you see a picture of the drawing of the virion, which is like a single virus. And maybe most interesting for this is that the red things that stick out, these are called the spike proteins. This is, literally they stick out of the virus. This is what encounters the cells when it tries to, and it does invade various cells. And vaccines, all of the vaccines are attacking that spike protein. Some of them may attack other things. In other words, they make antibodies against other things, but all of them are targeting that spike protein. So if you hear about S or spike, that's it. It's on the surface. It's a big part of the invasion. Now, what happens if you are infected with the virus, with SARS-CoV-2? Well, you could be asymptomatic, and that simply means you have no symptoms. You don't even know you're infected unless you do a test. And there's no reason you would do a test, probably, unless you thought you were exposed. You could also have mild symptoms. You could have, and the mild symptoms are generally fever, cough, shortness of breath. Those are all associated with your respiratory system. Fatigue, loss of appetite. The one set of symptoms that are considered almost diagnostic without having to have anything else, because a lot of things cause fever and cough, a lot of bugs, but loss of smell and loss of taste, sudden loss of smell and taste, this is a specialty of this virus. And usually it comes back when you recover from the virus, but sometimes people have prolonged things, but usually it comes back. You see other symptoms as well: loss of appetite, muscle soreness, sore throat, headache, nasal congestion, diarrhea. So you can tell already you've got diarrhea. It means the virus has gotten out of your lungs into your gut, et cetera. Although that isn't a major problem, but it can be a symptom. And the third thing that you see is, of course, in the red box, the severe symptoms of COVID-19. And this is the stuff that is really scary. And this is the acute respiratory distress syndrome, sepsis, which is infection of the bloodstream, which shouldn't be infected because it's sterile, septic shock. You can see horrible things. The blood clotting, that's an important thing when you think about what you're trying to prevent. We talk about that later. And multi-organ failure, and then death. And so this is the stuff, and if you want to take home one message from my entire talk, this stuff, this severe symptoms and death, is really what we need to prevent the most, and really what you want the vaccines to do. Everything else you'd like it to do. It'd be nice if it prevented the mild symptoms. It'd be nice if it prevented any infection. But as you can see on the right here, almost 88 to 98% of infections, people don't go to the doctor. It doesn't mean they have no symptoms, but they don't have enough to say, I need to go to the doctor. So this is a small percentage. I mean, 2 to 12% go to the doctor. And of those, a much smaller percentage actually have these severe symptoms. And that's, of course, what we're most worried about. Now, one of the big questions is what determines, are you going to get asymptomatic infection? Are you going to get really sick? And people have long talked about age as a factor, and older people, as you get older, you're more likely, but even then you got to get really old to be more likely. You've heard about the comorbid conditions, so things like obesity, high blood pressure, immunodeficiencies, diabetes. So these are not things, as far as I know, that make you more likely to get infected, but they make you more likely, once you're infected, to get really sick. Another thing that I have spent a lot of time thinking about and written a paper about, these two things here, the route of exposure and intensity of exposure. Now, you may recall in the early days of this virus, we were like, you had no idea really where it came from. Not only do you wear masks everywhere, in fact, maybe you shouldn't even go outside. In fact, you should wipe down all surfaces, wipe down your groceries. You should wash your hands 6,000 times a day. And because it wasn't clear, is it coming from surfaces you touch? Is it coming from if you swallow it? Is it coming if you touch your eyes? You remember that whole discussion about don't touch your eyes, and then Tony Fauci touched his eyes on live TV. There was a lot of confusion because nobody knew in the beginning. Well, now we do know that, and the CDC almost very recently has made it very clear that it's really in the air. It's the aerosolized spread that matters. So the route of exposure could make a big difference. It doesn't mean perhaps you can't get infected if you touch a surface and you maybe put it to your mouth and you go, oh, but it may not be, but I think there's a lot of evidence, and I may show you a tiny bit of it, that suggests you're not going to get very sick from that. The other part is intensity of exposure. Now, this is, again, something which isn't talked about much, but if you're sitting across from somebody in a bar who's coughing in your face, that's right Okay, aerosol right in your face, maybe right down into your lung, and a lot of virus. That's very different than somebody across the park who may or may not, say coughs in the park, but you're far away, the air dilutes it, maybe it never gets to you, but even if it did, it's a tiny fraction. So you may recall in the beginning, one of the most scary things about this were doctors in China who were getting sick. You go, oh my God, how can anybody prevent? Well, the doctors are doing procedures which are can expose them to very high doses and intensity of virus. And so this is something which I think we've learned is almost certainly a major contributor to people getting very sick. And then there's other elements: poverty, access to healthcare, ethnic group. And let me just show you this slide. Who goes to the hospital? And these are, I think, these are rates from last year. I'm not sure they've changed that much. Maybe they've changed a little bit. And you can see that the rate of people going to the hospital with COVID-19 is, what is it, 3 or 4 or 5 times higher in American Indian, non-Hispanic, Black, Hispanic than it is in white or Pacific Islanders. So why is that, do you think? And people have talked about, well, maybe are people in certain ethnicities more susceptible to getting sick? I think much of that, and I think there's a lot of evidence, is not because intrinsically Hispanics are susceptible to COVID-19, but because they can be in jobs that require close contact, continuous contact with people. They may have less access to healthcare quickly so that they couldn't get treated right away or seen. That these access to care issues, as well as occupational exposure, they tend to be in jobs that perhaps lead them to more exposure, that these are really the major factors. But nonetheless, you get this disparity. And so it's not the same for everybody to get infected. And as I mentioned, many people have talked about the importance of age, gender. Men are more likely, a little bit more likely to get sicker, the comorbidities, but also the dose and the route. So I wanted to show you this picture because I really thought this is fun. This is the fun part of science, in case you were looking for fun. And how do you actually test this idea that the amount of dose that you get infected with can affect how sick you get? And you can do studies in animals. Very easy to do studies in animals. Some people are starting to do studies in people, actually, where you deliberately expose the animal to the virus and you see what happens. And there's a Syrian hamster, golden Syrian hamsters. Maybe some of you have them at home. I don't know if they're actually pets, but they seem to behave very much like humans in terms of how they get infected, how they get sick, how often they die. They're much better models for reasons that we can talk about later than even monkeys, which is kind of strange. So, and it's nice because you can do studies with hamsters. And what people have done is actually put cages next to each other, and they'll have this set of cages with hamsters that have been exposed to the virus, so they're infected with the virus, and these cages, hamsters that haven't, and you just watch how quickly these guys get infected. So you can actually measure the transmission, the infection of these poor hamsters with these guys. And if you think about it, you could then do experiments like put masks on the surface. Here's a mask on the surface of the cage, and you can see, does the mask prevent them from getting sick? And the answer is yes. 100% no. Does the mask prevent them from getting really sick? And that's what this is interesting. It's not just that masks prevent you from getting sick, but as it says here, the protective effect of masking may not just determine success or failure of transmission, but may also determine the severity. So if somebody says, yeah, I don't want to wear a mask inside anymore, I don't need to, part of the reason is not just that maybe you won't get sick, but is if you do get infected, it'll be much milder on the average, not 100%. So that's something that I think is important when you try to figure out, why do I wear a mask and where, et cetera. Doesn't mean you wear a mask everywhere. The guidance has changed, and we'll talk about that. The virus. Okay, the virus itself, it should be admitted, is much more transmissible than most had anticipated. So here are some numbers. This is as of yesterday. There's a website at Johns Hopkins University that you can go on if you're interested. and see the rates of infections per day in the world, or in the US, or in different countries, or in even different states. And you can see the number of deaths per day. And so if you look here, the magic number at the moment of reported infections, so remember you have to get tested to be a reported infection, but a lot of people probably aren't tested because they don't feel sick or very sick, don't go to the hospital, don't go to a doctor. There's 150 million cases since the beginning up to this moment that have been reported, of which 32 million are in the US. So we have about 1/5 of the world's cases, and we don't have 1/5 of the world's population. If you look at deaths, it's about 3 million deaths in the world so far, and 580,000 in the US. And just to give you an idea, because in the beginning, many people compared this to the flu and said, well, it's kind of like the flu. I mean, flu does kill people, but it kills the people with comorbidities and older, but not that many. This is the number of flu deaths in an average in a year. And this is the number that's happened since a little over a year. It's quite a big difference. And you could say, well, why is that? And I think the major issue is it's not that the virus is really that much more nasty than the flu virus. It's just that everybody's getting infected. And in flu virus, not everybody gets infected at all. You have immunity from years past, but this guy seems to infect everybody. You can see the trends, and we can spend hours on this. This is, as an epidemiologist, I love this stuff. You see the trends in the world. It was going down, it's come back up. Deaths have gone down, come back up. What happened here? I think some of you know that this is essentially India in the world and parts of South America, Brazil. So while the US has happily gone down, and some other areas have happily gone down, not every place in Europe, for example, but a number, and certainly Asia. And the deaths in the US have gone down. Unfortunately, the battle is raging in some other countries that have had less vaccine and have less maybe lockdowns. So why is this thing so transmissible? So in contrast to the original SARS, which some of you may remember from 20 years ago in East Asia, which was very deadly, much deadlier than this guy in terms of percentage of people who get sick actually get really sick, get infected, get sick. Asymptomatic people can transmit. This was the big surprise. You could be infected, you have no idea, so you continue doing your business, going out, going the world, and you're transmitting it. So that is one of the big problems with this guy. And although people thought that contamination on the surfaces, on tabletops, on the handles of supermarkets, carts, that they were the reason, a way to transmit, they don't seem to be the major route. So they are for some other viruses, and so we don't want to say that's not important to clean, although I don't think it's important to clean the supermarket cart handle every 10 minutes. It's not really the major route for this guy. And what it is aerosol, which means in the air, and close contact in the air. The other reason that this is so transmissible is that none of our immune systems have ever seen, meaning be exposed to this virus in previous years. So influenza, every year there's an influenza, and while the influenza changes somewhat, you've been exposed, we've all been exposed to influenza viruses in past, and they provide some partial protection, or maybe total protection. Nobody's had that from this. However, there are, and we're going to learn more about this I'm sure, in the years to come, that exposure to common cold coronaviruses, which is a different virus, but they're called coronavirus, so they're related, actually may provide some protection, maybe part of the reason so a lot of people most people don't get very sick, is that they've got some immunity from coronaviruses that are from the colds that they've had years past. And that may be also some explanation as to why kids in general don't get very sick, because maybe they get more colds and they've had more recent colds and immunity, but we don't know that. Okay, so why is a vaccine a critical part of the solution? I mean, in the US, I feel like in some ways it's obvious looking at the US and looking at some other countries like India, but not everybody buys this. Well, there are other ways, as you know, as you've endured, as we've all endured, that you can try to prevent COVID and SARS-CoV-2 infection. These are called non-pharmaceutical interventions, or just a way of saying social distancing, environmental disinfection, hygiene, personal protection, mask wearing, lockdowns. These are non-pharmaceutical interventions which were used, certainly before we had any vaccine, and they're effective. They can be effective. At least I don't really think this one is, but most of them are effective to some extent. And you can see 1919. I love this picture. It shows you the last pandemic, people wearing masks. The Georgia Tech football game. This was the influenza pandemic of 1919. So the problem with these things, I don't even have to explain it because everybody knows this, is that they are broad brush. You're trying to prevent any infection, and they come at great psychological and economic costs, and they're very difficult to sustain, as we all know. And we're not really sure, really, which of these matter the most. And we've kind of learned this one doesn't. But we don't really even know with social distancing to some extent which are the places that matter the most, which don't. And we've learned, for example, that probably schools is not a big source of transmission. So even it's not all social distancing is the same. And the other reason that vaccines can help is because they really work. I mean, they really work. So even the most ardent anti-vaccine person who may have lots of reasons they don't like vaccines, unless you have zero interest in facts, cannot deny that smallpox was wiped out from the face of the earth through vaccination. These are the number of cases. This was a major killer, 300 million. What did we say so far? 3 million, 2 million in the COVID. This is 300 million people in the 20th century alone died from it, and it's gone. It's been gone since the 70s, and that's because of the vaccine. Here's an example of measles, which actually has killed many children in the US and still kills children around the world. And these were the numbers of cases of measles in the 40s and the 50s until the vaccine came in. So it's hundreds of thousands of cases per year. And yes, it's true that not most kids with measles don't die. I think I had measles. A lot of people have measles, but some do. And they can have some impacts. And this is what happened when the vaccine came in. This is a number of cases. And if you look out here in the recent years, you go, it looks like zero, but it's not zero. It's actually a few 100,000. It used to be 500,000. That's vaccine. So vaccines really do work. And these vaccines in COVID really do work. But they're not magic and they're not perfect. And we'll talk about that. Okay, so one key theme that I wanted to make sure I highlighted for you is that if you want to get rid of this virus and disease, you probably need to vaccinate. I mean, you can close your borders. You could be New Zealand. They got rid of it pretty much without any vaccine because they let nobody in and they could close the borders, and Australia pretty much. But if you want to get rid of it, but they're not going to get rid of it permanently unless they keep the borders closed, because it'll get in. And I'm interested to see with China, which got rid of it without vaccine, but we'll see what happens. These are the vaccines that are out there. I just want to give you an idea of the current list as of yesterday. There's a great website in the New York Times, COVID vaccine tracker. These ones in the red box are the 3 that are currently licensed in the US. You undoubtedly are familiar with the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the J&J, and we'll talk about those in a minute. There are some other vaccines out there. There's a Russian vaccine, Gamaleya vaccine, which I think I'll mention in a minute. There's the famous AstraZeneca vaccine, which has been subject to a fair amount of controversy. We'll talk about that. And there's a number of others, Chinese vaccines. And you can see different countries have approved them. In general, many of them are still considered emergency use approval. And you could say, well, why is that? Why isn't it just a regular approval? And the reason is that they were developed very fast. There is very clear evidence that they work. There's very clear evidence that they're safe in the short term, and we'll talk about that generally. But we don't know the long term. And generally, when you do vaccine studies, when you license a vaccine, you usually do studies that last a few years because you want to know what happens 2 years from now. We don't even know how effective these things a year later are, particularly. So you don't have the kind of information that would allow the FDA and the European regulatory agencies to say, here's a full licensure, because we know it'll last for a few years at least. We know it's safe for a few years at least. It's not that there are doubts about the safety so much, but there are questions about how long they're going to last. Anyway, but they are approved for emergency use, and this is what we're using in the US. So let's talk about these a little bit. Well, I just wanted to mention, you know how fast these things happen, and a lot of people are concerned about how fast. I was concerned about how fast. And you have to say, okay, what are you concerned about? Because normally vaccines, and I've been in this business a long time, take a long time to develop. So what is it that we're concerned about when we say it's so fast? Well, has it been tested in enough people? Well, the answer to that is, I can tell you, yes. These are huge clinical studies that have been tested in 40,000 people, 50,000 people studies. That's as big as you ever get, and that's bigger than most vaccine studies. So you do know that they've been tested lots of people. Do we know that they're effective? Yes, we do, because these, and I'll show you the data in the next slide. They're very effective. But do we know they're safe? Well, again, 50,000 people, you can do safety studies and say, I can tell a certain level of safety. Now, what you don't know, and this is what you find out only once you introduce a vaccine, is if something very rare happens, you're not going to find that out in 50,000 if it's a 1 in a million or 2 in a million chance. And the blood clot story, which you know about some of the vaccines you may have heard, is that kind of thing. It's a 2 in a million, and I'll show you a little bit about that. So we don't know that, but in general, the issue about this being so fast, I think that there has been mostly major technological breakthroughs. The regulators, who normally can take 9 months to review a file, did it, in a month. So they just went faster. They said this is a priority. So a lot of that is actually very positive. Okay, so this is some example of data from vaccines, and what we talk about is efficacy. So efficacy, clinical efficacy, is basically how well do you protect against diseases? That's the question. How well do you protect? And it comes in percentages. And if you prevented every single person who got the vaccine from getting disease, it's 100% effective. And if it doesn't work, if it's like having orange juice or water, it's 0%. Now, a vaccine which is 50% is actually quite good. It means you've got a 50% chance. So if there normally were going to be 100 cases in your city, there's only going to be 50. That's actually a pretty good intervention. These guys, these 4 here, Novavax, which isn't licensed yet, the Moderna and the Pfizer ones, and the Russian one, these are all different studies. You can see how many people were in the studies, tens of thousands, 36,000. They're all about 90-something%. That's really good for vaccines. That's what you like. Now, is it 90% effective for the next 20 years? I don't think so, probably not. But we know at least for 6 months, that's all we've had so far, the vaccines, that they're still 90% effective. You can see numbers of doses that they need to be given. And the only reason I show you this slide, for those of you who know, this is a confidence interval. What it says is, we don't know it's exactly this number. We think we're pretty sure, we're very confident actually, that it's between these numbers. And this is our best estimate, but we don't know. And so when somebody says, oh, Pfizer was 95 and Moderna was 94 and the Russians were, I don't know, 90, whatever that is, they're not different. They're not really different. They're the same numbers. So very highly effective. Let me show you something else. This is the J&J vaccine, which was just licensed. This is a single dose vaccine. And before we get into its famous controversy, which is about the blood clots, let's just look at the efficacy data for a moment. Now, they did studies in multiple countries. They did it, the global study adds up. They did studies in the US, they did studies in Brazil and South Africa. And that's important because people are different in different countries. The healthcare conditions are different, and sometimes vaccines don't work as well in one place or another. And one difference that can exist between countries is these famous variants, which means a different version of the virus. The same virus, but a little bit different. And there was a South Africa variant, the Brazil variant. They end up coming to the US, don't worry, they'll come here. Some of them are here already. The UK has a variant, and they're just slightly different. And so you want to know, does your vaccine work as well against those variants as it worked against severe disease? And so I want to show you this because I started off talking about what matters is severe disease. This is what is the most important thing to prevent. And if you look at all these different locations, US, Brazil, South Africa. South Africa had this variant. They are all 80s, mid 80%. These are the same number. They're not statistically different, despite the fact that this had all this variant here. And it's a high number for severe disease. If you look at moderate to severe, which is still, you're sick, but you're not, severe critical, so you can be pretty sick, but it's not the same as this. Then you see a lower number, and this is generally true for vaccines, that they're usually, ironically, more effective against the most severe form of the disease than they are against a milder, but still quite good, 60, 70% effective against moderate to severe. So this pattern of being more effective in preventing the most severe outcomes. So imagine if you had a column here that said death. How good are you at preventing death? They're all even higher. They're 90, 95%, 98%. So the J&J vaccine, like the other ones, is really good. And they've actually were able to show that against the variant. Here's an example. I don't know if I can get rid of this. I'm not sure I can. I hope if this is in the way or not. But this is a map of the variants of the world. The variants of the world. So there's lots of different variants. This is normal for a virus to change a little bit. Viruses, they're not sitting there just relaxing. They like to change. They like to change their DNA sequence or their RNA sequence. And these are forming variants. And you can see the different colors represent different variants who have these kind of esoteric names. And you can see that in South Africa, it's this color, which is, I don't know, the 20G or 20, I think it's actually this one, 20H variant. You can see Brazil had some different variants. UK had its own. You can see they're all over the place. And what do we know about variants? I mean, they're just simply different versions of the vaccine. Let me just see if I can, no, I can't get rid of that top bar. They're different versions of the vaccine, they're different versions of the virus. Some of them transmit more efficiently. So if you go into a room and everybody's got the South Africa variant, you might be more likely to get it than if you go into a room and everybody's got the UK variant or vice versa. So that's not good, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're more sick. It just means you're more likely to get it. And then it turns out that some of them might be a little more serious in terms of making you sick than more often. But the key point, and if you remember anything of what I say, the licensed vaccines show high protection against severe disease caused by the variants where they've tested. So this is still true. It may not be true in 6 months. Maybe find out, oh my God, there's a new variant, but it's still true. So these vaccines are great. And I want to go back to this one, just because we like to beat up on the Russians, and I like to beat up on the Russians. They have a really good vaccine here. I think they've got problems because they hide all their data. They didn't publish this for a while. They still don't tell regulators all the details of how they make it. But it turns out they made a pretty good vaccine. And the Chinese too have made pretty good vaccines. So it's not, that's important, but it doesn't mean you necessarily want to have this vaccine, because I don't know the incidence of side effects of this vaccine. I don't know if they can make it consistently, and the regulators are waiting for that information before they license it. So the vaccines are good. So let's talk in the last couple of slides about blood clots, because this is in the news, COVID vaccines and blood clots. And so let me just give you a little background. So reports have suggested that following the use of the J&J Johnson & Johnson vaccine, an increased risk of a rare adverse event called thrombosis, which is blood clot, with thrombocytopenia syndrome, which really means blood clots, thrombosis with low platelets, cytopenia, which is weird because platelets help you clot. You'd think if you have a lot of if you have low platelets, you wouldn't clot very much, but they do. And okay, let me just give you a few facts about it. So nearly all the reports, this is from the CDC, of this condition have been in adult women younger than 50. So for some reason, unclear, that's when they've happened. So that's only like half the population. Okay, but here's the numbers. There have been 8 million doses of this vaccine delivered in the US, or maybe worldwide, but I think the US. And of that, there have been 15 cases of this severe condition. All these people were hospitalized. So this is not something mild. This is not your mild COVID. And to date, 3 people have died, 7 still hospitalized, and 5 recovered, sent home. So 15 cases out of 8 million doses. And some association was not just seen only with this vaccine, but with AstraZeneca, so they were in the news too. It hasn't been seen in the same kind of frequency. This is 15 cases in 8 million, so that's 2 cases per million. But it hasn't been seen with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. Now, we don't like blood clots. Nobody wants side effects. Nobody wants severe side effects. This is not good. On the other hand, we have to keep in perspective that a lot of other things cause blood clots. Smoking, obesity, pregnancy, birth control pills, long flights. I had a long flight coming back from Europe last year, blood clots. And they are much, much, much more common than this 2 in a million. So it's not to minimize this, but to say you got to put it in perspective. And so when the CDC recommended the use to start to come back to use this again, remember the CDC put it on pause, the FDA put it on pause, wait, let me look into this. Why did they say it's okay now? Did they say there were no blood clots involved? No, they didn't. What they did, and what you have to do in any drugs or any pharmaceuticals or any interventions, you do a risk-benefit analysis. And they said, we reviewed all the data that we could find and what in terms of what the vaccine can do, the benefits of the vaccine, and what its risks are. And we concluded that we should resume. So why did they say that? I thought it might be interesting to show you on this slide. So they basically said, what happens if you were to continue using the vaccine for 6 months? What if we assumed that 10 million people would get the vaccine the next 6 months? Assume the vaccine was recommended for everybody over 18. How many hospitalizations would you anticipate would be prevented? So let's just take the moderate transmission, because you don't know how much disease is going to be circulating 3 months from now. Maybe it'll go down tiny little amounts, low. Maybe it'll stay fairly moderate. We don't know. Obviously, there's more hospitalization if there's more virus flowing around. So this is how many hospitalizations these 10 million doses would prevent, 9,000. How many people go into intensive care, how many deaths would be prevented. And this is how many of the blood clot cases you would expect to have. Even if the rates of disease go down, so the potential benefit of the vaccine isn't as much because there's less cases, you still get numbers that are pretty high. You get 26 blood clots. So this is the basis upon which they said, 1,400 deaths versus 26 cases, which a few will probably die, although we know how to treat these, we'll be on the alert for these better. So that was the basis of this. And this is true no matter what you recommend, aspirin or seat belts. There's always going to be benefits and risks, and you have to decide, is the benefit worth over the risk? So I think this is my conclusion slide. The real problem with COVID, I don't know, I keep saying it because I think it gets forgotten, is really the severe disease. And the number one priority of a vaccine is prevent severe disease. And to date, several of these vaccines are very effective to prevent severe disease, a typo there, regardless of the variant. So of course, controlling mild disease and transmission is important. Nobody wants this virus to be circulating. I don't think we should be obsessed with that. However, without high vaccination levels, and you're hearing this in the news, this is not rocket science, and not just in the US, but elsewhere, it will be extremely difficult to eliminate this virus. So as long as India is happily turning away, or unhappily, horrifically turning away, as long as other countries in Europe have the virus, in Latin America, it's going to get back in the US. Hopefully people are, highly vaccinated and we're getting there, but it'll still be around because people aren't always getting vaccinated. People aren't always, behaving ways. And so we may very well end up, and I know the head of Pfizer happily said this the other day, but I don't like him. Periodic vaccinations may be needed. This may be true, like flu. Maybe for a while, or maybe for a long time, every year you get a booster. I don't know. It's not clear yet. And although the Pfizer guy was very excited to talk about that because he would sell another lot of vaccines, we don't know that. So nobody else says that's true, but it's possible, certainly possible. And it may also be possible that with some of if some variants come in that are different than what we've seen so far, nastier, that the viruses, the vaccines themselves will need to change a little bit. And I think the good news is that we know how to change them really quickly, and Pfizer and Moderna and others are working on versions against variants, and I'm sure they'll be very effective. But you have to then change the vaccine. So that may be another reason why you needed to get a booster, because there's a new variant coming from Antarctica next year. Hopefully not. Hopefully, it'll dissipate, but something that's quite possible. The other part I don't mention here, and maybe you're thinking about this or not, is that kids may not they don't get very sick very often. Of course, a small number do, and it's very nasty, but it's a very small number. But they do have the virus, they can transmit it. So the idea that we can just vaccinate adults and say bye to the virus, that's not going to work. And so what the companies are doing is clinical trials in lower and lower ages. And I think I read today that Pfizer said, we're going to apply for what they call an indication, which means a permission to be used, this vaccine in 2-year-olds, 2 to 18-year-olds. Is it going to go below that? I don't know. But obviously school kids and adolescents can get the virus. I mean, if they don't necessarily get sick, they can transmit it. So I think it's going to be I'm pretty sure that the recommendations will be everybody, at least down to that age, are going to be recommended to get the vaccine because they can transmit to other people. So that's what I wanted to talk about. I'm happy to take your questions and comments. I hope it was interesting and hope it was clear. But if the things aren't clear, please just ask the question, and because other people probably didn't understand either.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hausdorff. I really appreciate the presentation, number one, in terms of taking a lot of information, complex information, and distilling it for us to get really those takeaway messages through, and using your illustrations there of the slides to bring the message home there. And I do want to get to some of the questions that were put here in the chat. I'm just going to remind everybody that we were able to record tonight's program. Once we have that edited, we'll put it up onto our YouTube page. And one second note, which is that May 12th, next week at 7 p.m., Dr. Hausdorff will be doing a similar program in Spanish. So please feel free to spread the word. We feel like that's another important effort in helping spread this information. So let me get to some of the questions that were put here in the chat. Let's see. How far down the road could a vaccine be developed that could provide protection against all known coronaviruses to date?
That's a great question. There are people not just talking about it, but saying, here's how we might do it. There's been the holy grail in influenza vaccination has been a vaccine that would prevent against all these flu viruses, because every year getting a new one, that sucks. And they haven't gotten there yet. So we have to be a little careful on this to think that it's something that's easily done. But one of the things we learned in this coronavirus development, it wasn't just that things were tested quickly. The vaccines were made so quickly, and that's a function of scientific knowledge that has just been exploding the last couple of years of how to make these vaccines, and this whole messenger RNA approach is a new thing. And so that does open the possibility of making potentially vaccines that might be effective against a broad array of viruses. I actually heard a presentation, which it's probably pie in the sky, of somebody at the NIH, one of the people who helped develop the Moderna vaccine. And he said, we have this plan or this idea. We've looked at the world of viruses, because there's many different families of virus. Coronavirus is just one family. There's lots of different families. I can't remember how many, 15 different, all the viruses in the world have their own little family. And we think we could make a generic vaccine against each of the family. We could make 15 vaccines to prevent everybody in that family, Now, okay, he did make the Moderna vaccine, so you give him some credit for that. But that's kind of a cool idea. So I think, on the one hand, I wouldn't be putting my money on it, wouldn't put my Bitcoins on it right now. On the other hand, I do think there's maybe some very interesting things coming. So stay tuned, but not tomorrow.
Okay, another question. Since the common cold is also a type of coronavirus, will this COVID-19 vaccine protect us in some part from the common cold?
I don't know. That's a good question. I've never heard anyone even mention that, but it's a great question, and it's a logical question. There have been people looking at how much protection the common cold gives us against. Well, okay, I should mention the common cold is caused by a number of viruses, of which coronaviruses are only a couple. There are other viruses, different families. Now you know about virus families that can cause it. So clearly, this vaccine wouldn't prevent the common cold caused by some other viruses. But whether it would have some impact on the coronavirus common cold, that's a good question. And if I had to bet now, since we seem to be betting here, I would say probably would have some effect. But how much, I don't know.
Great. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Another one. Excuse me. When you say that a vaccine has been effective over 6 months, is that based on a group of people who are continually tested over a span of time to test effectiveness? In other words, what data are scientists looking at to determine how long a vaccine is working?
Yes, that's a good question. And I didn't really go into the details of how you do these studies. So the data that I showed you, these 90% effective things, that comes from what are called double-blind, randomized, controlled trials. So what does that mean, double-blind? It means, first of all, that there's a group of people who got the vaccine and a group of people who didn't. And the blind part means they didn't know if they got it or not, and nor did the doctors know who were seeing them. So they couldn't be biased and say, oh, I know Mr. Smith didn't get the vaccine, so let's make sure we test him quickly. So they're totally randomized. So whoever went in there, it wasn't like, we'll take the first, all the 80-year-olds, you're in this group, and the 50-year-olds, you're in this group. Totally randomized, double-blind controlled trials. And the way they work is that they immunize them, and then they go, okay, live your lives, please be careful, wear your masks, et cetera, but that's it. And then if they got sick, then they would go to the study doctor, or the study doctor would say, oh, you got sick with something looks like coronavirus. They would test you so they would know, was it a coronavirus or not? Was it the SARS-CoV-2 or not? So they did that no matter when the person got sick. The person got sick 2 days later, 4 days later, 2 weeks later, they would test. And they still actually wouldn't tell the person, I don't think, during the trial, oh, you were vaccinated, you weren't. It didn't really matter. You're sick, so you're sick. But at the end, they were able to say, okay, after 6 months of this, and indeed, they know people, they followed people, it's called following, for 6 months. They know that even at 6 months, there was a big difference between the number of people who had disease, who had gotten COVID, and the people that didn't, and it's still 90%. And if you look in these articles, if you look carefully, they will show you day by day, they'll show you curves of who's getting sick and who's not. So you can find out, for example, that 5 days after vaccination, there was no difference. The vaccine wasn't doing anything. The same number of people got sick in both groups, wasn't that many, but the same number. 10 days, again, the same number. 14 days, now you see a difference. People in the vaccine group are not getting as sick. People in the non-vaccine group continue to get sick, new infections. And you could actually tell, this is how long it takes for the vaccine to work. So that's in general why I could say with confidence, it's this effect for 6 months. The other way people can guess at whether it's effective is whether they still have antibody levels, because what a vaccine does is stimulates your immune system. That's how it differs from a drug. It's not actually killing the virus itself. The vaccine doesn't. It doesn't attack the virus. It stimulates your immune system to attack the virus. And the stimulation is in the form of antibodies. You make antibodies when you get the vaccine. And so hopefully you make antibodies. And so you can measure the amounts of antibodies and see, okay, after you get the vaccine, 2 weeks later, you got these really high levels of antibodies. Maybe after 3 days you didn't, but 2 weeks it's high. And you could look to see 6 months, are they still high? They could come down a little bit. So that's another way people have used to try to predict how long these vaccines, because you can sort of see over time, the antibody levels do go down. Are they going down sharply? No. but they are going down. So you can imagine at some point they get below a level which is protective. So the answer to your question is that 6-month thing is real data. That's hard data, clinical efficacy. We know it prevents disease. And beyond that, we still don't know. We can guess with antibody data.
Great. So there was a related question. I think you may have answered this just now, but it was another question about how do you know the vaccines are 90% plus effective? Are the people who got the shot exposed to COVID-19 and then you see how severely they get sick?
Exactly. So that's the key to these trials, these double-blind randomized trials, is that they don't happen, you're not shut into a hotel room and locked there for 6 months. People are out in the world and they're doing what they do. And even though as a ethical physician, you'll say to them, I'm not a physician, but I am ethical, I think. You say to them, don't, you should wear your mask, you should not go to bars, you should, avoid crowd, whatever. You can say that, but people live their lives. Now, you could be worried. One of the reasons these are blinded is because you're worried. I would be worried. If I knew I got the vaccine, I might be less likely to wear the mask. And if I knew I didn't get the vaccine, I might be more likely. So you could introduce differences between the group and how likely they are to be exposed just by letting them know if they got the vaccine or not. So by keeping it blinded, what you find out is that the idea is that the likelihood of being exposed to the virus is the same in both groups because there's no reason it could be different.
Great. So we do have some more questions related to that, though. So for those who have been, I'm lucky to say myself, I'm fully vaccinated. Why should I continue to be wearing a mask? Can you explain a little bit more about why that's important?
Yeah. So I don't think if you're outside in a park, you should be wearing a mask unless you're surrounded by 6,000 people closely together. So I don't think you should always wear a mask no matter what. I don't think inside your house you wear a mask, and I'm sure Jeff, I assume Jeff, you don't, I hope not. But if you go into a place, so the reason is the number that I showed you, they were not 100%. So there were people who got the vaccine, got it on time, got both doses of the vaccine 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, got the disease, got infected. So they're not perfect. So that was one of the themes earlier on that I wanted to highlight. These vaccines are great, but they're not perfect. So you still can get infected. Now you go, and I have said, okay, but if you get infected and you've been vaccinated, aren't you more likely not to get very sick? And that is true. And there is actually evidence that that's true. That even those people who had a breakthrough infection, who got infected, if they've been vaccinated, they're much more likely to be even more likely than people not vaccinated to have mild disease. And they're already pretty likely. So it does provide some protection, but it's not 100%. And there are people who have had 2 doses who may not have had a great response. Who's the 5% that got disease? It may be that they didn't make many antibodies, maybe because they've got some immune system issue themselves. It may be because they just don't respond for some reason. It's a small percentage. So that's the answer, is that you still are at risk. It's much less risk. And again, it's this benefit risk. So the idea of if you're meeting up, I think the CDC said this, with other people who are not, everybody's vaccinated, you have a party or a gathering, should you be wearing your mask? They go, no. Does that mean that there's zero risk in that situation? No, but it's so far below what it was. So it's a numbers game. It's a chance of things happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, another question. Should vaccine passports be required for all travelers, regardless of country of origin or destination?
Well, currently, if you visited certain countries that have yellow fever, which is a viral disease that's really nasty and can kill you, if those countries have yellow fever sort of circulating, which is certain countries in Africa and in Latin America, parts of Brazil, and you go to other countries, you need to show proof that you've been vaccinated. There's a yellow fever vaccination card. I have a yellow fever vaccination card. So the idea of having vaccination cards is not just come up for COVID. It's something that, and it's widely accepted. There used to be a cholera vaccination card, but the cholera vaccine actually wasn't very good. So it's kind of stupid to have that. But the yellow fever vaccine is very good. It means something. So I actually do think that having a vaccination passport is a very good idea. I think you can say, well, how far do you go? Is it 100%? You have to have it. What if you've already had infection with COVID, because that will provide you with some protection against future. We know that now. Is it as good as a vaccine? Probably not, but it still gives you something. So I think there are nuances, but you're seeing this happening, and whether people should or not, you're seeing other countries. Europe is talking about this very seriously. Some countries are very specific. I think it's going to happen because, again, it's been used in the past for yellow fever. So I think it will. I don't know if everybody will do it. I'm not sure everybody in the US will put up with it, but maybe then you won't be traveling to France, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay, another question. Can you explain how the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was developed and how they have used that technology previously to develop other vaccines?
That's kind of a loaded question. So the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is one of the so there's lots of different ways to make a vaccine. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, so there's the mRNA thing. There are, let's see how far back I want to go in this. The Johnson & Johnson technology, what they used actually has been used, as the person who's asking probably knows, to make the first Ebola vaccine, or one of the first, not the first, but one of the first effective Ebola vaccines. So the same technology was used. This technology involves something called an adenovirus. So we were talking about common colds. What causes common colds? Well, coronavirus, you've learned that. Adenovirus, some adenoviruses, which is a different family, cause common colds. And what I think the Johnson & Johnson crowd did, and actually the Russians also used this approach, and also somebody else, maybe J&J, used this kind of approach. They used an adenovirus, and they put, which normally doesn't cause anything. Maybe it it's not even cold causing viruses. They just infect you. Johnson & Johnson used one that infects chimpanzees. Doesn't normally infect people, and if it does, it doesn't cause any issues. They used a chimpanzee adenovirus as a means to make sure that the virus will get into your body and will replicate and cause you to make an immune response. Because normally when you get infected with a virus or a bacteria, your body naturally makes an immune response. And what a vaccine is pretending it's the virus or the bacteria. So your body goes, oh my God, the virus, bacteria, I'm gonna make an immune response. But the difference is the vaccine doesn't cause a disease, whereas the virus and bacteria can. So it's a race to normally it's a race. So they used this adenovirus, which they knew would infect people. It's very good to infect people and not cause anything. And they put a little piece of the coronavirus, in fact, the S protein, those little spikes that came out, they put a little piece in that adenovirus. And that's the technology that they used, which is very effective. And they had done that previously with a little piece of the Ebola virus. The Ebola vaccine contains that. The Russians used different adenoviruses, and the Johnson & Johnson used a different adenovirus. So there's different ones you can use. And now actually AstraZeneca and the Russians are kind of teaming up so that the first dose will be one of their vaccines and the second dose will be, they're testing this, thinking that might even be better because they're not exactly the same adenoviruses, but it's the same concept. So it's called a viral vectored approach. It's clearly very effective. The AstraZeneca vaccine, for all the AstraZeneca's craziness, is actually quite effective and against the variants as well, for severe disease against the variants.
Very interesting. Couple more questions here. I think you've covered this a little bit. Do vaccines protect us against all variants?
We don't know. We don't know. And in fact, what we do know is that it also depends, what are you trying to prevent? If you're trying to prevent mild disease, I can tell you, no, they don't fully protect. And you've seen this in the news. And in fact, that famous AstraZeneca vaccine did not look like it prevented mild disease very well at all in South Africa. And for a while, South Africa said, well, I don't want that shit. But it turned out that it prevented very well against severe disease caused by the variants. So against severe disease, against the variants we know so far that have been around so far, yes, they do prevent. Against mild disease, some do better than others. I think the Pfizer and the Moderna actually have done pretty well against mild disease caused by the variants, but I'm not sure that J&J, but you saw the differences. I'm not sure J&J has been great against the mild disease, but it's still good. Will there be variants that they don't protect against? I don't know. We'll see. But actually, people are worried about it. So the bad news is that it could be. The good news is that people are, looking at all the viruses that are causing disease everywhere, including in India, because there was some thought maybe that's what's going on in India. They got a new variant. But I think most people don't think that's the reason it's going crazy there. But we'll find out. And the good news also is that the companies are actively making the next generation version of their vaccines, which I guarantee will be registered in 12 seconds if they really need it.
There's a related question. What causes variants?
So what causes variants? Viruses have to make copies of themselves. That's called replication. So, viruses have to grow and make more copies and copies and more copies, et cetera. Every time you make a copy of something, you can introduce little changes. You make a photocopy, it's not exactly the same as the first one, a little speck of dirt on that second photocopy. And you make a photocopy of that one, and there's, another speck of dirt. So that happens with viruses too. Different viruses are better at replicating than others. One that's really infamously bad, HIV. So HIV replicates, and they're one of the major problems in the vaccine field, maybe the major problem. Why there isn't an AIDS vaccine is they just replicate they form variants all the time. A single person who's infected with HIV makes, I don't even know what the number is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't thousands, maybe it's just hundreds of different variants. A little bit different. So it's a matter of how faithfully they make a copy of themselves. This virus, I was actually asking somebody this who knows much more about these viruses than I do, and it's sort of like it's not great. It's not terrible. It's not the HIV category, but it's not great in terms of making copies of itself. One that makes copies of itself really well, measles. So measles virus, it's always the same. Or hepatitis B, they're almost always so similar. And that's one of the reasons vaccines against them have lasted for 30 years. Nobody's seeing any problems. They still work just as well. On the other hand, in this case, you're going to see variations already.
Okay. If you have, an adverse reaction to the vaccine, do you still get protection from the virus?
There is almost certainly, yes. There is adverse reaction. What does an adverse reaction mean? It could mean fever, could mean it hurts. When I had Moderna, it hurt. It hurt the first day. That's the word. It wasn't too bad for me, but that's an adverse reaction. If you feel fatigue from the virus, if you have chills, some people have chills the second day from some of these, that's an adverse reaction. So what the adverse reaction means literally is your body, your immune system is going, what the hell is going on here? It's reacting to the vaccine. So it's actually a sign that your immune system is reacting. And people have speculated, and I suspect there are studies, and I keep thinking I should look them up, that say the adverse reactions actually correlate with better protection. So people have said, well, if I don't have anything, I didn't feel anything. Oh my God, does that mean the immune system was asleep? Didn't even notice that there was something there, didn't make antibodies, anything. I think the answer is no to that, but it may be that actually some adverse reaction is a good indicator that your immune system is engaged and doing what it needs to do, and it takes a couple of weeks to get itself in order. So no, if you have an adverse reaction, you may go, God damn it. But at the same time, you may say, my immune system is clearly awake, and that's good, and that's what I want.
Got it. Another question. Should vaccinated grandparent see their 5-year-old grandson in the house without a mask?
I think I'm not the CDC, but I think the CDC has already pronounced that people who have been vaccinated, fully vaccinated, if everybody can see other people are fully vaccinated, and if you say the 5-year-old who hasn't been vaccinated, that's the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then it's what is the concern? Is it the concern that the 5-year-old is going to get the virus from the parents? No. The grandparents? Probably not. Is the concern that the grandparents are going to get infected by the 5-year-old? So it's a good question as to whether you would. Should they see them? I personally, without being the CDC, would say yes. Should you be smothering them as much as you want to with kisses? Maybe, but I would be maybe slightly more cautious. But if you're vaccinated, these are highly effective. And one of the big questions with these vaccines was, would they be effective in the older people? Because a lot of times vaccines are not that effective. And the answer is yes, they're really effective in older people. So the grandparents are not like, this is not like flu vaccine, which works in older people, but it's not great. It works much better in healthy young 40-year-old adults, 30-year-old adults. This is not like that. This is a vaccine that works very well. So I think you have to use your discretion, but I'll use an example. I am going to be a grandparent soon, which is very exciting. I'm fully vaccinated. I certainly will be, and that little goober who won't be 5, but will be obviously born, and then I'm sure won't be vaccinated for a while. I would certainly plan to see them, and I wouldn't be masked and all that. So, but I can't say for sure, and I'm not sure what the CDC recommendation is on that. They probably say use your discretion on something like that.
Yeah, it's a very tricky question. The person who asked it said that they were concerned about, I think themselves, the grandparents getting infected from it being transmitted.
So again, but I think the question was asked, should they see the 5-year-old? Of course. Should they be in the same room? Of course. Does that mean you are next to them all the time? That's the only time you're really going to be potentially exposed, I think. And then even then, I think it's your discretion.
Got it. So that's the questions that I have there in the chat. I did have one further question, and I know this is going to be, I think, not a question to put you on the spot, but just to sort of get your opinion. In terms of public health policy, what sort of lessons, and it's maybe too soon to tell, but what sort of lessons are you taking now for the next virus that comes around? And also, is there better ways that this information, which I think you did a terrific job today of explaining to all of us, do you have ideas or suggestions in terms of how that information could be best communicated to the general public?
I do have ideas on this. I'm somebody who gives lots of talks, not necessarily on COVID, but on lots of topics, of vaccines, et cetera. So I do think a lot about communication. And I look at some of whom are former colleagues at CDC. I think we did have an unfortunate situation a year ago where the CDC clearly was being very politicized and was not allowed to say certain things. That's really bad, undermines credibility. But let's assume so obviously one conclusion is don't politicize the public health agencies, and whoever's in power, that doesn't help. It just makes people suspicious and not believe anything. But beyond that, I do think there are some lessons learned that I'm not sure are there yet. For example, in the beginning, we don't know lots of things. You don't know almost anything. You don't know how this is transmitted. You don't know how many people how is this much worse than other viruses? In the beginning, if you look in the early newspaper articles, and I've given talks, they'll talk about, there was one in San Diego Union Herald saying, don't walk by the beach because you just don't know what's in the ocean because it receives effluent and there could be spray in the air. And we know, spray, come on, aerosol, you might get infected by walking by the beach. And so you had stuff all over the place, and obsessively cleaning everything and having the new occupation of supermarket cart handler disinfector, which is wild. in the beginning, you go, okay, I didn't know. I don't really know how it's transmitted. I don't know if it's really possible you can do this. But pretty early on, it was clear that it could not be transmitted like that, because otherwise everybody would be sick tomorrow. There must be ways that are much more meaningful than others. And I think one thing that hasn't been communicated, and I don't think Fauci has done a great job. I think Fauci's generally done a pretty good job, but I don't think even he has done a great job, and the CDC, of saying, at the time I said that because we didn't know. We since have learned, and we don't need to do that. That kind of idea of we since have learned, and not saying, I'm sorry that at the beginning I said this necessarily, but pointing out that what we know changes, and that and that's human, that's life. And so I think that builds the case for, and to admit right now, I don't know, this question about variants, I don't know. I can tell you to date, they have not escaped the vaccines when you're looking at severe disease. Is it possible they will? I don't know, and so, but to be able to say these things, I think, and to admit it, is something that the public health community has not been good at. I think the other thing is that they should have been much quicker in stopping certain intervention. I think we knew there has never been, ever been evidence from an epidemiological perspective that surfaces with virus on it is a major form of transmission. There's never been. And so very early on, I think the CDC and others could have said, hey, you don't have to wipe your groceries down. I mean, it's not just CDC. The French authority did this, the UK authority. In the beginning, they did, okay, maybe you say we don't know. But pretty soon, it was clear this is not a way that people are getting infected. And I think they should have very early on said that. I think the message about masks is another one. I tried to show you this. What are masks about? Well, in the beginning, I was skeptical of masks, frankly. The mask can do, and masks, come on, give me a break. You can get air this way. It turns out there is data. Masks do prevent, but the issue that masks don't just prevent you from being infected, but will prevent you from getting really sick if you do. That message, I think, still isn't really out there very well. So that I hate masks, I hate masks. Well, think about it. It's not just about getting it or not. And you've seen other people get infected and they don't get very sick. So why should I worry? It's about protecting yourself against getting really sick. So I think there's these nuances. I think early on, the CDC and the others should have been peeling away some of the interventions that are almost certainly not a big deal. The schools is another one where I don't know how many of you follow this, but in Europe, they had schools going almost the whole time. And Europe has had high rates of disease, just as we have. And they've had lower rates, they've had higher rates. But in general, they have tried to keep schools open. Now, does that mean automatically we should have done that at the beginning? No, I'm not saying that, because we didn't know how much transmission comes. But after several months, there have been a lot of studies looking at this issue of, do schools seed outbreaks? And the answer is no. That when there are outbreaks, which are rare, there tend to be extracurricular activities, playing ice hockey in school teams. That may be, but not classroom for whatever set of reasons. So could we have communicated that earlier so it's not just a one size fits all? I think so. So I think nuancing the messages, but starting out not politicizing and not making it this partisan thing, which is terrible.
Absolutely. Well, I again, I appreciate your answer there, and I think it certainly, to me, illustrates just the importance of understanding what science is. Science is basically, this is what we know to a fair degree of certainty. This is what we know to a greater degree of certainty, and this is what we don't know. There is no 100% certainty out there, but again, it's just as you pointed out there, the nuance is really the key takeaway there. If we know that it's 90% effective or something like that, then that's really important information to act upon. So anyhow, I want to thank you again, Dr. Hausdorff, for a terrific presentation, and then of course taking your time and your knowledge here and answering all the number of questions that we have. Just a reminder, everybody, May 12th at 7. Dr. Hausdorff will be giving another presentation in Spanish. There's information on our website about that. I want to thank everybody else for being here, for your terrific questions today.
Can I make just one quick comment, Jeff, before you hang up?
Please go ahead. Yeah, absolutely.
just because I know it's recorded and I don't want to leave the impression that I'm telling the CDC was terrible, they've done a terrible job, public health officials terrible. It is so easy to look back and say, you were wrong, you should have done this and this. But at the time, even now, but at the time, when you only have a limited amount of information and you can imagine all sorts of scenarios and you've got so much pressure from different parts of society, it's a very, very tough job. And I think the public health people, have gotten really, a lot of them, the crap beaten out of them, and a lot of them have left the profession because they get hounded out of their jobs. And I'm sure there are people at CDC who will be retiring as soon as they can because it's brutal, just like a lot of physicians. But so I think everything I said is just trying to say, look back. And I think the idea of admitting you're wrong and stuff, but it's a tough, tough job. And as we know, the stakes are very high because of economic issues, because of mental health issues and isolation, because of education issues. So it's easy to look back. But I do think the next one, I hope we'll be a little bit better and sort of along the way revealing what we don't know and what we now have learned. And so therefore, here's what we're doing.
Absolutely. Very well said. Well, again, I want to thank you for the terrific presentation today. Yes, I'm so happy we're able to record it, and we'll be able to post that for more people to be able to get this information. And we look forward to seeing you at future programs. And again, appreciate you spending some of your evening with us. Wish everybody health and safety, and be well out there, and enjoy the rest of your evening.